Dr. Alistair Finch built his career on facts, on data that couldn't lie. Lead poisoning killed the Franklin expedition. Case closed. But when he opened that frozen logbook, the evidence told a different story. The crew heard something in the ice, something that drove them mad. And now, standing in an Arctic crater at midnight, staring at an impossible crystalline structure pulsing with alien light, Finch realizes the truth. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to consume you. Dr. Alistair Finch stood at the lectern not as a man, but as an instrument of pure reason. Before him, the tiered seats of the university lecture hall were full, a sea of young, impressionable minds and older, tenured ones, all held captive by the force of his certainty. Behind him, a high-resolution photograph dominated the screen, the blurred, sonar-scanned outline of a ship, a ghost slumbering beneath the Arctic ice. His voice was a calm, measured thing, honed by decades of dismantling lesser arguments. It filled the auditorium, leaving no room for doubt. The tragedy of the 1845 Franklin expedition, he began, his tone patient as if explaining a simple equation, is often romanticized. It's a story draped in the alluring shrouds of mystery, of cannibalism, of heroic men succumbing to an unforgiving wilderness. These are compelling narratives, but they are just that, narratives. The truth, as is often the case, is far less romantic. It is metallurgical, it is chemical, it is found not in heroic myths, but in the granular, irrefutable data. He clicked a remote, and the image shifted to a graph displaying lead isotope ratios. For years, we've known the crew's tinned provisions were sealed with lead solder, poorly and hastily applied. The evidence is etched into the very bones of the few crewmen recovered. Lead poisoning, chronic, debilitating. It leads to neurological decay, to paranoia, to madness. It weakens the body, making it susceptible to the cold, to scurvy, to starvation. He gestured to another slide, showing historical weather charts of the 19th century Arctic. Combine this slow, insidious poisoning with 2 consecutive, unusually brutal winters, and the mystery evaporates. There is no monster, ladies and gentlemen, no ancient curse from the ice. The enemy was in their food. The monster was in their own blood. The story of the Franklin expedition is not a horror story. It is a case study in catastrophic systems failure. A student in the front row raised a hand, asking about Inuit oral histories that spoke of strange behavior among the Franklin crew long before starvation would have set in. Finch offered a wry, almost pitying smile. Oral traditions are invaluable cultural artifacts, he said, the condescension smooth as polished glass. But they are not empirical evidence. Memories shift, stories evolve. Lead concentrations in a femur do not. We must follow the data. All other paths lead to speculation, to fantasy. He held the room in the palm of his hand, a high priest of the rational, his gospel written in charts and chemical analysis. For Alistair Finch, the world was a complex but ultimately solvable puzzle, and he was a master of finding the pieces that fit. The call came 2 days later, cutting through the monastic quiet of his book-lined office. Anna Sharma's face materialized on his monitor, pixelated and delayed by a poor connection from some remote satellite uplink. She was an official with the Global Maritime Heritage Foundation, a woman whose face carried the weary competence of someone who managed billion-dollar projects in impossible locations. "Dr. Finch," she began, her voice tinny. "Apologies for the directness. We re-on a secured channel, but bandwidth is at a premium." Finch leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. "Anna, good to see you. What can I do for you?" "It is what we can do for you, Alistair," she said, and a smile broke through her professional veneer. An oceanic survey team, contracted for seabed mapping off King William Island, found an anomaly, a significant magnetic signature where there should be none. They sent down a submersible drone 6 hours ago. She paused, letting the weight of the moment build. It's the Erebus, not a wreck, not scattered timbers. The whole ship. It's sitting upright on the seabed, encased in a freak pocket of deep channel ice. It sits perfect. Finch's breath caught in his throat. He felt a sudden, electric jolt, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a child unwrapping the one gift he'd wanted all year. He mastered his expression with professional discipline, but he couldn't stop his eyes from darting to the antique map of the Arctic hanging on his wall, its faded ink tracing the expedition's doomed route. "We remobilize in the North Star," Anna continued. "The finest icebreaker on the planet. We're setting up a full recovery and preservation operation. It's the find of the century, Alistair, and we want you to lead the historical consultation. On site." The offer hung in the air between them, the chance to step out of the lecture halls, to leave the theoretical behind, to be the first historian in over 170 years to set foot on that ship, to prove his theories, once and for all, with the ultimate primary source. "I assume my winter gear is still in good standing," Finch said, his voice a model of professional gravity that betrayed none of the wild schoolboy excitement churning in his chest. "When do I leave?" The Arctic was not a place, it was an absence of colour, of life, of warmth. From the window of the helicopter, all Finch could see was an endless, blinding expanse of white, a fractured plain of ice under a pale, indifferent sun. Then, a shape emerged from the vastness, the icebreaker North Star, a colossal beast of red steel, its hull a defiant slash of colour against the monochrome world. It was moored against the ice floe, a temporary city of heated tents, mobile labs, and humming generators sprouting around it like a futuristic colony. As the helicopter descended, Finch saw it. About a half-mile from the ship, surrounded by a perimeter of floodlights and scaffolding, was an impossible silhouette. 3 masts, skeletal and bare, clawing at the sky. The unmistakable shape of a 19th century British naval vessel held fast in a crystalline cradle of ice. HMS Erebus. It was like seeing a dinosaur, flash frozen and perfectly preserved. The helicopter's skids touched down with a soft crunch. The moment the door slid open, the cold hit him a physical blow, clean and sharp, stealing the air from his lungs. A figure bundled in Arctic gear approached, pulling down her fur-lined hood. It was Lena Petrova, the on-site logistics chief. Her face was ruddy from the cold, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "Dr. Finch!" she shouted over the dying roar of the rotors. "Welcome to the top of the world!" Finch, feeling clumsy in his borrowed gear, could only stare past her at the ship. The scale of it, the sheer impossibility of its preservation was overwhelming. "My God," he breathed, his words turning to instant vapor. "It is real. More real than you can imagine," Lena said, her expression a mixture of professional pride and profound awe. "We've managed to stabilize the surrounding ice and establish an entry point. The interior is pristine. It is a tomb, Doctor. A perfectly kept tomb." But Finch didn't see a tomb. He saw a laboratory. He saw the ultimate data set, a time capsule that held the final, irrefutable answers to the questions he had dedicated his life to asking. The human horror of the 130 men who had perished here was an abstraction, a historical fact. The ship, this magnificent specimen, was the reality, and it was waiting for him. He wore a sterile, clean suit, the kind used in operating rooms, but the chill of the Erebus seeped through it, a cold that felt ancient and profound. Inside the ship, the only sounds were the whisper of his own breathing and the crunch of his boots on a thin layer of frost that covered everything like a funeral shroud. The air was still, heavy with the silence of over a century and a half. He moved through the narrow corridors, his gloved hand brushing against walls, feeling the grain of the wood beneath the ice. It was a world frozen in the middle of a sentence, a pewter mug on a table, a pair of spectacles resting on a book left open, its pages stiff with ice. He was walking through a photograph, and the reverence he felt was so immense it was nearly suffocating. Lena led him towards the stern, to the Captain S cabin. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been left. Finch pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a masterpiece of preservation. Charts and maps were still pinned to a corkboard, their ink faded but legible. A sextant lay on a small desk, gleaming under the beam of his headlamp. It was all exactly as it should be, a perfect diorama of a life interrupted. And there, in the center of the main desk, was the prize, the captain's logbook. It rested under a thin, clear sheet of ice that had formed over it like a pane of glass. Its dark leather cover was unblemished, the gold leaf lettering of HMS Erebus still faintly visible. It was the Holy Grail, the one object that had been missing from the historical record, the one thing that could settle all the debates, end all the speculation. Finch approached the desk slowly, as if it were an altar. He reached out a gloved finger and rested it gently on the icy surface covering the book. All the theories, all the lectures, all the years spent in dusty archives, it had all led to this single point in time and space. Inside that book was the truth, his truth, the final data points that would confirm the elegant, rational, scientific explanation for everything that had happened here. He had no doubt what its pages would say. He was certain. The mobile lab on the North Star was an island of sterile warmth and light in the vast Arctic darkness. Inside, the 170-year-old logbook, the heart of the entire operation, rested in a climate-controlled glass case. A delicate robotic arm turned each page after it was painstakingly thawed and stabilized, while high-resolution cameras documented every word. Dr. Alistair Finch stood beside the case, dictating his notes into a small recorder, his voice brimming with the quiet satisfaction of a prophet whose prophecies were coming true. Lena Petrova managed the equipment, her movements efficient and precise. Log entry, September 12th, 1845. Finch read, his voice echoing slightly in the clean room. Initial wintering preparations are proceeding on schedule. The men are in good spirits. Game has been plentiful. Exactly as expected. This aligns perfectly with the supplies manifest recovered from the Beachy Island depot. He allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Entry, October 7th. The ice has enclosed us fully. We are now a winter island in a frozen sea. Note the Captain S stoicism. No panic. A professional assessment. For the first few days, it was a litany of vindication. Every entry confirmed the historical record and, more importantly, Finch's own meticulously constructed models, the dates of the first frostbite cases, the notations on dwindling coal supplies, the first mentions of rationing it all fit. The data was clean. The narrative was pure. "You were right, Alistair," Lena said, looking up from a monitor displaying a magnified image of the script. "It is all playing out exactly like you've been saying for years." Finch nodded, looking at the book with an almost paternal affection. "Science is not about being right, Lena. It's about building a model that withstands the evidence." He paused, leaning closer to the glass case. "And the evidence here is unequivocal. It's all here, just as the data predicted." His world was orderly, his theories confirmed. The universe was, for the moment, making perfect sense. A week bled into the next, marked only by the changing shifts of the North Star S crew and the slow turning of the logbook S pages. The initial exhilaration of discovery had settled into the long, grueling rhythm of methodical work. Finch now spent most of his time alone in the lab, often late into the night, immersed in the fading words of Captain Crozier. The stack of empty coffee cups beside his workstation grew into a small tower. He was deep into the winter of 1846 now, and the tone of the entries was beginning to shift. The Captain's confident looping script had become tighter, more compact. A new element had appeared, a detail absent from any historical account. November 3rd, Finch murmured to himself, reading from the screen. A peculiar phenomenon has been noted by the crew. A low, incessant hum, seemingly emanating from beneath the hull. It is most noticeable in the deep quiet of the night. I have dismissed it as the ice groaning under pressure, yet its regularity is unnerving. Finch stopped. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a familiar gesture of fatigue and concentration. A hum. He typed the observation into his own digital log, bracketing it with notes. Possible source: tectonic friction of the ice sheet. Thermal contraction. He opened a new browser tab and began searching for geological surveys of the region, looking for any record of unusual seismic activity between 1846 and 1848. The search results were sparse, inconclusive. A dead end. He turned back to the logbook entry, reading it again. The Captain's dismissal felt forced, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his log. For the first time since opening the book, Finch felt a flicker of something other than academic curiosity. It was a small, dissonant note in his perfect symphony of data, a crack in the flawless logic. He told himself it was nothing, a sailor's superstition, a symptom of isolation, but he couldn't shake the final word of the entry: unsettling. The mess hall of the North Star was loud and bright, a welcome contrast to the sterile silence of the lab and the oppressive quiet of the Arctic. Over plates of steaming stew, Finch brought up the hum to Lena, hoping that saying it out loud would shrink it back to a manageable, explainable detail. It is a classic symptom of prolonged stress in a hostile environment, he said, stirring his food with more force than necessary. It could be a mass auditory hallucination, or simple tinnitus brought on by severe malnutrition, which we know was beginning to set in around that time. Hell, it could even be an early neurological symptom of the lead poisoning itself. The brain plays tricks. Lena listened patiently, her fork paused mid-air. She had a way of listening that made you feel truly heard. The captain mentions it more than once though, right? 6 times so far, Finch admitted, each time with more descriptive language. And the other crewmen? They heard it too. According to Crozier, yes, most of them. Lena put her fork down. Alistair, the log also says they could feel it. The entry from November 19th. He writes, "It is a vibration, a trembling in the soles of our boots, in the timber of our bunks. That's not in your head. That's a physical sensation." Finch waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that felt less confident than it looked. Psychosomatic response. One man gets a headache. Suddenly everyone has a headache. It's group psychology, entirely explainable. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. He was explaining away the data, not analyzing it. He was fitting the evidence to his theory, not the other way around. Lena didn't push back. She just watched him, her gaze clear and steady. She didn't need to argue. Her simple, logical question had done its work. Finch found he couldn't quite meet her eye, and he turned his attention back to his stew, which had suddenly lost its flavor. That night, the lab felt different, colder. The familiar hum of the climate control unit seemed louder, more intrusive. Finch sat before the monitor, the words of the logbook painting a scene of escalating dread. He was now in the spring of 1847. The Captain S handwriting was becoming erratic, the ink smudged in places, as if by a trembling hand. And then he came to the entry that would change everything. It was dated April 29th. The entry began not with a report on the weather or the crew's health, but with a name: Seaman Collins. "A terrible incident today," Crozier wrote, the script jagged and sharp. "Young Collins has gone mad. Utterly. For weeks he has been complaining of the song in the floorboards, as he calls it. Today, his mania reached its peak. He was found screaming in the galley, hammering his own head against a table, shouting for it to stop. When men tried to restrain him, he fought with a terrible strength, clawing at his own ears until they bled, crying that he had to let the song out." Finch felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He read on, his own breathing shallow. He broke free and fled the ship, running out into a blinding blizzard, armed with a pickaxe from the geology stores. He was not dressed for the cold. He simply ran into the white, screaming. The final paragraph of the entry was almost illegible, a frantic scrawl. "We found his body this evening, after the storm broke, 2 miles from the ship. He was frozen solid, of course. But the strangest thing, the most ghastly thing he had been digging. The pickaxe was clutched in his hands, its tip broken. Beside his body was a shallow, desperate hole in the ice, no more than a foot deep. As if he was trying to get at something beneath him. As if he was trying to silence the sound at its source." Finch leaned back in his chair, his face pale in the glow of the monitor. The sterile lab, the scientific equipment, the entire rational world he had built around himself seemed to recede. This wasn't a symptom. This wasn't a psychosomatic event. This was a man, driven to a horrific, insane death by something he heard coming from the ice. The why of the Franklin expedition's demise had suddenly, terrifyingly shifted. It was no longer a simple case of poison. It was a case of a hunt. Sleep did not come. In the sterile confines of his small quarters on the North Star, Alistair Finch lay staring at the ceiling, the horrific image of Seaman Collins clawing at his own ears seared into his mind. The pursuit of sleep was futile, so he turned instead to the only comfort he had ever known: work. He sat at his small desk, the glow of his tablet casting long shadows across the room, illuminating his drawn, haggard face. On the screen, he had created a meticulous digital workspace. The scanned pages of the logbook were on one side, and on the other, a series of spreadsheets he had built from scratch. The ship's daily ration logs, the official sick lists, meteorological data, every quantifiable piece of information he possessed. With a desperate, methodical rigor, he began to cross-reference. He was a scientist, and this was how a scientist tamed chaos. He would find the correlation. He had to. He mapped the dates of Captain Crozier's increasingly bizarre entries against the crew's diet. No link. The men who described hearing the hum were often the same men noted as being in perfect health. He checked their duty rosters. Men working on the upper decks heard it just as clearly as the men in the engine rooms. He cross-referenced the entries with the phases of the moon, the tides, the recorded temperature fluctuations. Nothing. There was no pattern, no logic. The madness, as Crozier described it, was a contagion that jumped from man to man without any discernible cause. One day, a man was noted as hale and hearty. The next, he was listening to the ice, his eyes vacant, his ears plugged with scraps of cloth. Finch was actively trying to disprove the narrative he was reading. He was searching for the flaw in the Captain's account, the inconsistency that would allow him to file it all under the neat heading of lead-induced paranoia. But the logbook was stubbornly, terrifyingly consistent. It wasn't the journal of a madman. It was the meticulous account of a rational man driven to madness by an external force. Every failed correlation, every dead end, was another nail in the coffin of his own beautiful logical theory. This was a direct assault on his life's work, on the very methodology that defined him. He was trying to disprove a hypothesis, and the evidence was only making it stronger. The next morning, Finch walked into the mobile lab looking like a ghost. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, his movements slow, as if a great weight had settled on his shoulders overnight. Lena was there, carefully analysing the crystalline structure of frost patterns on a recovered sextant, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he entered, and her professional demeanour softened with concern. "Alistair? You look terrible. Did you get any sleep at all?" Finch walked over to the central console and leaned on it, the gesture lacking his usual confident posture. He stared at the image of the logbook on the main screen, not speaking for a long moment. He seemed to be gathering the courage to say something he had never said in his professional life. "The lead poisoning theory," he began, his voice low and raspy. "It doesn't fit." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a kind of weary surrender. "It doesn't fit the timeline of the madness. It doesn't fit the evidence of the crew's behavior. It doesn't fit what he wrote. It was a confession, an admission of failure from a man who had built his entire career on being right. To say the words out loud was to make the failure real. He was no longer Dr. Finch, the unassailable expert. He was just Alistair, a man lost in a mystery far deeper than he had ever imagined. Lena looked at him with profound empathy. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't offer any easy answers. She simply stood with him in the uncomfortable silence, acknowledging the magnitude of his admission. "Then what does?" she asked softly. Finch stared at the logbook on the screen, at the spidery, frantic script of a long-dead man. He had no answer. That night, Finch read the logbook with a new and terrifying purpose. He was no longer trying to debunk it. He was trying to understand it. He had surrendered to its narrative, and it was pulling him deeper into a world that defied every law of science he held dear. He reached a pivotal entry from the summer of 1847. The Captain S language had transformed completely. The precise, observational tone of a Royal Navy officer was gone, replaced by the feverish, awestruck prose of a mystic. "The sound is no longer a simple hum," Crozier wrote. "It has changed. It has acquired patterns, a rhythm, like a monstrous heart beating in the deep. It is complex now, a language of low frequencies. I find myself listening for its phrases in the quiet hours. I believe it is a form of communication. I believe it speaks." Finch felt a cold dread wash over him, a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air outside. He kept reading, the words pulling him under. "We have been so arrogant in our assumptions. We came here with our tools of measurement and reason, believing we could conquer this land. But we were wrong. It is not our minds that are failing. It is the world itself that is wrong, or at least our understanding of it. God has no place here. The Church of England is a phantom from another reality. There is only the ice, and there is the song it sings, and we are merely here to listen." Finch was now reading the core of a fully formed, superstitious worldview, a direct and terrifying antithesis to his own. It was a belief system forged in isolation and fear, a rational mind snapping and creating a new religion to explain the inexplicable. He, Dr. Alistair Finch, who had built a career on mocking such beliefs, was now its sole living student, forced to engage with a text he would have once dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. The storm hit the North Star just before midnight, a furious blizzard that threw itself against the ship with a primal roar. The lights in the lab flickered once, twice, and then died. the constant, low hum of the Icebreaker S generators. The background noise Finch had become so accustomed to vanished. The entire world was plunged into the dim, eerie glow of the emergency backup lights and a profound, shocking silence. Finch sat frozen in the sudden quiet, his heart hammering in his chest. The silence was absolute, deeper than any silence he had ever known. It felt heavy, expectant, and then he heard it. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling. A low, deep vibration that seemed to rise up from the floor, through the soles of his boots, and settle deep in his bones. Then, the sound followed a faint, resonant hum. It was impossibly low, on the very edge of human hearing. It wasn't the groaning of the ship's hull or the howl of the wind. It was structured, rhythmic. It was the sound of a monstrous heart beating in the deep. It was the exact sound Captain Crozier had described. Finch looked up slowly from the illuminated page of the logbook, his eyes wide, his face a mask of dawning, unadulterated horror. The words on the page were no longer just a story. The phenomenon was not confined to the past. It wasn't history. It was here. The hum faded as the emergency generators kicked in, flooding the lab with harsh clinical light and the jarring noise of machinery. The moment was broken, but the silence that preceded it had changed everything. Finch scrambled from his chair, his mind reeling, a frantic energy seizing him. He stumbled out of the lab and ran through the ship's corridors, bursting onto the bridge like a madman. The bridge was a scene of controlled chaos. Engineers in headsets shouted diagnostics at each other, their faces illuminated by the green glow of systems monitors. They were frantically working to restore main power. Finch grabbed the arm of the chief engineer, a stout man named McGregor. "Did you hear that?" Finch's voice was wild, breathless, just now, in the silence. A vibration, a sound from the ice. McGregor gave him a strange, pitying look, shaking his head. "Hear what?" "The primary generator's failing." I heard that. Sounded expensive." He turned back to his console, dismissing Finch entirely. Finch moved from crewman to crewman, his pleas growing more desperate. It was a hum, a low, rhythmic hum. You must have heard it. They looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. They offered rational explanations, the hull, groaning as it settled in the cold, the resonance of the backup generators kicking in, the wind. They were the voices of reason, the same voices he himself had used his entire life. He was now on the other side of the argument, and he saw the wall of skepticism for what it was. Impenetrable. Frantic, he ran to the mobile lab, grabbed a state-of-the-art high-fidelity audio recorder, and plunged out into the raging blizzard. He stood on the deck, the wind tearing at him, holding the sensitive microphone out into the white chaos. He stood there for 10 minutes, his hands growing numb, praying to capture the proof. When he returned to the lab and played back the recording, all he heard was the screaming, featureless roar of the wind. There was no hum, no vibration, no evidence. There was only his own testimony and the terrifying dawning thought that perhaps the madness of the Erebus was contagious. The video call the next day was an inquisition. Mr. Sterling, the corporate patron of the expedition, appeared on the conference room screen, his image crisp and clear from a polished boardroom halfway across the world. He was in his 60s, with a mane of silver hair and the predatory stillness of a shark. He did not look pleased. "Dr. Finch," Sterling began, his voice dangerously smooth, "I've been reading your preliminary reports. They are inconclusive. They are filled with conjecture, with psychological profiling based on a single compromised source." He steepled his fingers. "They are, to be frank, not what we are paying for." Finch, still shaken from the night before, tried to explain. "The evidence in the logbook is challenging the established theories. The lead poisoning model doesn't account for the behavioral specifics. The timeline Sterling cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave. The specifics are the ramblings of dying, desperate men. Your job, Doctor, is to validate the historical significance of this find, to give us a clean, understandable narrative. The world understands tragedy. It understands poison. It does not understand hums. He leaned closer to his camera, his eyes cold and hard. Stick to the lead poisoning. It s clean, it s tragic, and it s marketable. It will look wonderful on the museum plaque we are funding. Do not chase ghost stories from a dying man's diary. Am I making myself clear? The threat was unspoken, but absolute. Fall in line, or your career, your reputation, will be forfeit. Finch was no longer just fighting a mystery. He was fighting the men who wanted to bury it. The conflict was no longer about science versus superstition. It was about truth versus profit. Sterling's threat lit a new, desperate fire in Finch. He was running out of time. He grabbed Lena, and together they returned to the Erebus, a sense of grim urgency propelling them. They weren't looking for data to fit a theory anymore. They were looking for anything that corroborated the captain's terrifying story. If you were a terrified sailor, and you wanted to leave a message no one would find unless they were looking for it, where would you put it? Finch asked, his voice echoing in the frigid crew quarters. They searched for hours, their breath misting in the cold air. They checked under floorboards, behind sea chests, inside empty barrels. It was Lena who found it. Behind a loose bunk in the enlisted men's quarters, she pulled away a plank of wood. The wall behind it was covered in carvings. They weren't random scratchings. They were deliberate, a series of strange, elegant spirals, unlike any known maritime art. And next to them, a series of tally marks, arranged in repeating patterns. "It is not a calendar," Finch said, running his gloved finger over the marks. "There are too many, and not enough." Lena pulled out her tablet, her mind, always practical, already working the puzzle. She brought up a chart of 19th century astronomical data. "They were not days, Alistair," she whispered, her eyes wide. She cross-referenced the tally marks with the dates of the logbook's strangest entries. They were nights, specifically the nights of the Perigean spring tide, the new moon, when the lunar pull is strongest. Finch stared at the carvings. When the tides are at their lowest, he murmured, the pieces clicking into place with a dreadful sound. When the ice is at its thickest and under the most pressure from the seabed, when the sound would be clearest. It was physical proof, a secret record of the phenomenon, kept by men who knew the officers would never believe them. He wasn't crazy. It was all real. Finch reached the final pages of the logbook that night. The paper was stiff. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. Captain Crozier's handwriting had deteriorated into a barely coherent scrawl, the script of a man who had left reason far behind. The words described the crew's final, insane decision. They were abandoning the ships, not to seek rescue, but to seek the source. "The sound has called to us," Crozier wrote, the words sprawling across the page. "It promises a silence in its heart. We will hunt it on the ice. We will go to it. We will either silence its song or join it." It was a suicide pact, a pilgrimage of collective delusion born from an unbearable noise. Finch's blood ran cold. He turned to the very last page. It contained only two things. The first was a set of navigational coordinates, a precise location on the ice, a few kilometers away from the ship's final position. The second was a single, terrifying phrase, scrawled with such force that the pen had torn the paper. "The ship is a drum. The sound is a voice. But it is not a voice. It is a mouth." Finch stared at the words, the capital letters screaming from the page. A mouth. He looked at the coordinates on the screen, a blinking red dot on a digital map. Then he lifted his gaze to the window of the lab, out at the endless, frozen, and utterly empty wasteland of the Arctic night. He was no longer a passive observer of history. The logbook had given him a destination. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that he had to go. There was no debate, no second guessing. The moment Finch showed Lena the final page of the logbook, a silent, grim understanding passed between them. Sterling had forbidden any unsanctioned expeditions, placing guards on the motor pool and equipment stores. It didn't matter. An hour after midnight, while the North Star slept under the ghostly shifting curtains of the Aurora Borealis, they slipped out of a little-used maintenance hatch. The cold was a solid wall, but their purpose was a fire that burned against it. They hot-wired a snowmobile, its electric engine a soft whine in the vast silence. With Lena driving and Finch navigating via a tablet displaying the logbook-esque coordinates, they sped away from the halo of light surrounding the North Star, plunging into the profound darkness of the Arctic night. They rode for miles. The only sounds the crunch of snow beneath their treads and the whistle of the wind. Then, Lena slowed the vehicle. "Do you hear it?" she shouted over the engine. Finch strained his ears. At first, there was nothing. Then he caught it. It was faint, almost subliminal, but it was there. The low, resonant hum. It wasn't just in his head anymore. It was a shared experience, a low thrum that vibrated up from the ice itself. As they drew closer to the coordinates, it grew steadily louder, a bass note that seemed to resonate with the very structure of the world. Finch was no longer chasing a ghost. He was committing an act of pure faith, a rebellion against his career, his reputation, and the very scientific principles he had once held sacred. The GPS led them to the edge of a wide, shallow crater. It was perfectly circular, its edges too smooth to be a natural formation. It looked like a scar, thousands of years old. And at its center, the source of the hum was revealed. It was a structure, but not one of any known design. A massive, crystalline lattice rose from the ice, perhaps 50 feet high, its surface a complex of interlocking geometric shapes that seemed to defy Euclidean space. It was not built, it looked as if it had grown. A faint, internal light, a sickly blue-green, pulsed within it, a slow and steady beat that matched the rhythm of the hum now vibrating through the ice. The air around it felt charged, static. It was ancient, alien, and utterly terrifying. Finch and Lena dismounted, walking slowly toward the edge of the crater. It was then they saw the bodies. Frozen into the ice at the base of the crystalline structure were the remains of Franklin S. men, at least a dozen of them. They were not scattered, not fallen where they stood. They were arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies facing the structure, their frozen hands still clutching pickaxes, shovels, and saws. They had died in the middle of their final, desperate act, a ritual of either worship or destruction. They were silent sentinels, guarding the impossible thing they had discovered. The superstition was real. It wasn't a story or a belief. It was a place. It was a thing, and it was waiting. Suddenly, a new sound tore through the night, a violent, mechanical roar that shattered the unholy peace. A helicopter. It crested a nearby ridge, its searchlight pinning Finch and Lena in a brilliant white glare. It was Sterling. He was landing his security team directly in the crater, his arrogance blinding him to the sanctity of the place. As the helicopter descended, its powerful rotors kicked up a hurricane of snow and ice. The intense, low-frequency vibrations washed over the crystalline structure, and the structure reacted. The faint blue-green light within it exploded, brightening to a blinding intensity. The deep hum instantly escalated, becoming a deafening, physically painful roar that vibrated in their skulls, threatening to tear their minds apart. The entire crater began to shake violently. Massive, deep cracks shot across the ice, racing out from the structure like black lightning. The ancient crystal was breaking apart, destabilized by the brute force of Stirling-S intrusion. The hubris of the modern world had awakened the ancient power it had stumbled upon, and the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. "We have to go! Now!" Lena screamed, grabbing Finch's arm and pulling him back toward the snowmobile. Behind them, the world was ending. With a final, deafening shriek of tearing ice and tortured crystal, the ground gave way. A massive chasm opened up, a black wound in the white landscape. The crystalline structure, the source of the sound, plunged into the depths, its light extinguished in an instant. The chasm widened, swallowing the frozen bodies of the Franklin crew, then the helicopter and Stirling-S team, their shouts and alarms consumed by the roar of the collapsing ice. Finch and Lena scrambled onto the snowmobile and sped away, not daring to look back as the chasm sealed itself with a final, shuddering groan. And then, silence, a true and total silence. The hum was gone. They stopped a mile away, looking back at the transformed landscape. The crater was gone. The unnatural smoothness was gone. There was only the ice, white and pristine, as if nothing had ever been there. All the proof, the structure, the bodies, the helicopter was gone, buried thousands of feet below. All they had was their shared testimony and a 170-year-old logbook filled with the ravings of a dead captain. Finch looked out at the horizon. He had confronted the impossible, a truth that science had no language to describe. He had survived. But the man who had arrived in the Arctic, the arrogant, certain pragmatist, was gone, buried in the ice just as surely as the crystal. He had no evidence that would hold up in a lab, no data that could be peer-reviewed. He only had the experience, the memory of the sound, and a newfound humbling understanding of the vast, terrifying scope of what he did not know. He had set out to solve a mystery, and in the end, he had become a part of it. What a story. At the beginning, we represented with such a clean, satisfying answer to the Franklin mystery, lead poisoning. It is scientific, it is logical, and it tidies up a messy chapter of history. There's a real comfort in that kind of explanation. It puts the world in a box we can understand, where every tragedy has a clear material cause. But then, the logbook introduces a completely different kind of truth. It's not a truth of data, but of experience. The idea of a sound from the ice, a song, a mouth is so much more terrifying, isn't it? Because it can be measured or explained away. The scientific answer explains how the men died, but the logbook S version tells us something about the horror they felt. It taps into a much deeper, more primal fear of the unknown. In the end, Dr. Finch is left with no proof, only his memory of a truth that defies science. He becomes the very thing he used to mock, a believer with a story no one else will accept. It leaves us with a fascinating dilemma about what constitutes truth. So, I'll leave you with this question. When your own experience directly contradicts the rational world, and you have no way to prove it, where do you draw the line between faith and delusion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.